Welcome to the Mutually Amazing Podcast. I'm your host, Mike Domitrz with the Center for Respect. The episode you're about to listen to was recorded when this show used to be called the Respect Podcast, so you might hear that mentioned during this episode. Well, let's get to the show. This week we have Kinza Khan with us, domestic violence attorney at a legal services nonprofit organization in Chicago. Thank you, Kinza, for joining us.
Of course. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. How did you get into this work, or what got you into this work?
That's a good question. So when I was in law school, I knew that I wanted to help with giving a voice to marginalized communities. And I realized that the marginalized communities were often immigrants, women, any minorities really, and then victims of crimes and victims of violence were often silenced and marginalized. And it was an issue in our communities and all the different communities I've worked with. So I started with volunteering in law school at a domestic violence legal clinic, helping people at the courthouse. I was very shocked to see, because I'm born and raised in Chicago, but I did not realize how this side of Chicago, or this part of the culture that was around me at all times. And then after law school, my first job was in abused and neglected children, working with the foster care system and child welfare court. And then after that, I transitioned into domestic violence with families, so like domestic violence in all forms. And then now I'm doing domestic violence and family law.
The journey makes sense, right? It all took each step one at a time, flew from the step before. And a lot of times when people talk about domestic violence, they have assumptions that it's specific cultures, specific demographics. Is that true?
No, it's not. It's interesting because I had my own assumptions too, and working in this field helped me become more aware and stump those assumptions. I have noticed that in different communities, it shows up in different ways. So like there are certain domestic violence tactics that abusers will use when we're in an immigrant community, because immigration status is one of the ways that they can threaten someone to stay with them, for example, things like that. So it will have different forms, but it's not more likely to happen in one community over another, no.
So I'm just going to back up a little bit there for our listeners. You're referring to the abuser abusing somebody who's an immigrant and saying, if you say anything, I'll have you sent back to your country, or I'll tell the authorities and they'll send you back?
Yes, that's one example. I mean, there's many, but holding their green card, or the person who is an immigrant, for example, not having English, not having the language ability to communicate with authorities, or to not having the, sometimes it's even not having access to their own green card and documents because the abuser has kept them, which is coercing someone into a relationship or keeping someone from leaving. And so that intimidation, those threats will often be a form of abuse, will be used to abuse. So, I mean, that's one example. So I've noticed that different communities and different cultures have different ways of abusing, because people will use what they can to exert power and control. But it's not, certain communities are not immune from domestic violence, unfortunately. It's a universal problem.
Yeah, a lot of times I've met people who said, well, I'll give you an example of this one that actually I heard. Somebody's like, I come from a wealthy, white, upper suburbia community. That doesn't happen here. And I literally knew somebody in that community that nobody would have ever have thought was a survivor of domestic violence that absolutely was. And due to the person's job, they thought, well, that's a high-powered person. There's no way they're a survivor. That was another myth they had, right? That survivors are weak, quiet people, right? And so they had that myth also. This can't be this strong, opinionated woman, professional woman. That's not a survivor. There's no way, not in this community. So let's back up to help all of our listeners. What is domestic violence? Like, what qualifies? Because a lot of people think when they hear domestic violence, and I'm a little trigger warning here, but they assume, that's somebody slapping somebody, hitting someone, pushing someone, which absolutely can be forms of. But what qualifies as domestic violence?
That's a really great question, and you're right. Oftentimes, people, I've even had clients come in, and they're like, when I ask, "Is there any domestic violence?" They're like, "No, no, he doesn't hit me." And I'm like, "Okay, well, let's talk about the other things. Like, what else does he do? What names does he call you?" And then by the end of that same conversation, I have to be the person who delivers the unfortunate news. Like, no, this qualifies as domestic violence, at least under the Illinois Domestic Violence Act. And so, okay, so I'll talk about what that is. So domestic violence can be physical, but it's not limited to physical. It can also be verbal, emotional, psychological, financial. These are all forms of abuse. So there's, for example, verbal abuse is constantly putting someone down. So constantly either like cussing at someone or swearing, calling them names, and threats. Threats are also qualified as verbal abuse. Even accusations. I see a lot of cases in which there's accusations of cheating or accusations of just things that are not true, untrue accusations. A repeated pattern of any of this qualifies as domestic violence. And so that's verbal. There's psychological as well. We've lately been hearing the term gaslighting more. And gaslighting is one of the forms of psychological abuse, which qualifies as domestic violence.
Kinza, can we explain what that is? A lot of times people hear the term, but they don't really understand it. They're hearing it politically, and so they don't really understand what it may even mean politically, but they definitely don't understand what it means in the home.
Yes, that's a good question. So gaslighting came from a movie that was placed in Chicago called Gaslight, and it's back from the 80s or something. The movie's kind of old. And so it comes from that movie. And basically the term means to manipulate someone by getting them to question their own sanity. And so if someone says like, "Oh, you're crazy, that's all in your head," or like, "That never happened, you're making things up." And in the movie, there was something to do with lights. Like the guy was, I think he was like dimming the lights consistently, but and then she would notice, like, she's like, "Ew, does it look different?" And he's like, "No, it looks the same," because that's back in the day when they had they were using gas lights, and so before all the electricity that we have today. And so she was like, it looks different, and he was like, "No, no, you're just going crazy." And so the term is, it's a form of psychological manipulation, and it's making someone else question their own sanity, their own perception, their own memory. And so saying you made that up, that never happened, or when it did, or saying, that's all in your head, or that's not even true, like you're crazy, or you're losing your mind. And then, once it's a repeated statement, it starts becoming internalized by the receiver of this statement. And so that's gaslighting. Someone can, start questioning their own sanity. They can start questioning their own memory. Even the act of doing that to someone else, trying to get someone else to question their own memory, is also gaslighting. And there are different definitions depending on how someone wants to, like how broad or narrow someone wants to define this. But gaslighting and psychological abuse also include things like pushing someone, manipulating someone. So pushing someone to the point where they, like, for example, giving the silent treatment for a long time, and then pushing someone to the point where they cannot, where they kind of blow up, they kind of lose their mind, and they're like, you kind of pushed them and provoked them and got under their skin because you know how, and then the person blew up, and then you're like, "Wow, look, you're the crazy one, you're the one who blew up," and making them believe like you're the crazy one because you're the one who lost your mind or lost your control. But really, like, the first person was the one who pushed them to that point, knowing that that would get under their skin, knowing that that was provoking to them. So it's also a form of psychological abuse. So these are they're less obvious, which is dangerous because they're more hidden and people don't often know what's happening to them until after the fact. It's easier to see, oh my gosh, this happened in retrospect. It's harder to see when we're in the situation ourselves, or before it happens, to see the warning signs.
And so let's go right into that. What are red flags people should be watching for? And maybe not even, there's two ways here. One, in your own relationship. Two, in those around you, right? Who may be may not, I don't want to say hiding because it sounds intentional and hard, like they're doing something wrong, but there may not be an obvious way of knowing it. And I think there's maybe even a question, is it possible there are people, and that's why I'm curious how you answer this, who engage in this behavior, abusive behavior, who are unaware of it, which does not excuse it. But if they were aware of it, would stop. Is there any signs that that shows true? Or is it more, hey, we need to help survivors recognize the red flags and the people who have survivors in their lives?
Yeah, that's a great question because I agree with you. It does go, it is a multi-dimensional thing. And so in terms of abusers not recognizing their own behavior, yes, I do believe that many abusers, many people who abuse are not aware because oftentimes, the second that they get hit with an accusation of, being an abuser, or the second that in court, they're called, a perpetrator of domestic violence, or that they see that their victim is now seeking a domestic violence case or domestic violence attorney, then they do oftentimes lose it. They get they feel like they're being attacked. They feel like it's an unfair accusation. They feel like they don't qualify. They're like, I'm not that guy. I'm not that person. My actions were justified. And so I do see that a lot, actually. And I think oftentimes the person who is abusing has been the victim. I don't want to say always, because that's not always true, but oftentimes, and I can't even say most of the time or less than 50%. I can't even put a number like that on it. But oftentimes the person who is abusing has been abused in the past. And it's a cycle. And that's why it's really important for intervention to take place. So if someone has been abused, if they seek counseling or therapy, or there are programs as well for this specific purpose, that can help break the cycle of abuse. But abuse is often a cycle. And then in terms of the red flags to watch out for, the warning signs to watch out for, so you mentioned like a 2-tier. So 1, if it's happening to you, and 2, if it's happening to someone around you. So if it's happening to someone around you, this one's the easier one to answer, so I'll do that one first. So if it's happening to someone around you, there are ways to notice that. And so one is if the person seems like they don't have as much agency over it. So domestic violence is all about power and control, and it's not about sex or money or the other issues that people often disguise it to be. It's about power and control. So say if a friend of mine was in a violent relationship, or was in a relationship that could qualify as a domestic abuse, then I would notice for signs of her being losing agency over her own life. So if she and I normally send text messages and talk on the phone and plan to meet up, and we can meet up alone wherever we want, as a friend, then, and if all of a sudden that has stopped, then that's something that I should be aware of, like what's going on. If she doesn't seem to have access to her phone, her messages, if she has to be careful about talking to me in front of the person she's with, then that also can be a sign. And one of these things in of themselves may not be a sign enough to conclude that there's definitely domestic violence going on. So I don't want to say like either of these is a automatic red flag and jump to a conclusion, but the more the signs that there are present, then the more weary one should become, and the more careful one should become about what's going on. So losing agency over their own lives, not being able to come out as much, a lot of power. And so any control dynamics, if a friend of mine is being controlled, if I feel like she's not allowed to wear what she normally wears or what she wants to wear, if she has to do things only to please this person and has lost agency over her own choice of clothes, choice of timing, choice of a hobby or whatever we do, choice of plans. So things like that. That's how I would notice it in someone else around me, is a disruption in their pattern of how they were normally. And oftentimes an abuser can also prevent someone from talking to their friends. So isolation is a huge control tactic. It's very, very common. So isolation is a big warning sign as well. Isolating the person from their friends, from their family, from access to law enforcement, access to their phone, access to coworkers. I've seen a lot of cases in which the person doesn't let them work. And a lot of it is because the threat of that person being around other people at work and disclosing what's going on with them, might get the abused person. So might get the victim.
Right. It might expose the abuser. Right.
Exactly. So that's a common one. So isolation is a huge one. And then in terms of red flags, it's the warning signs when it's happening to ourselves. So I always joke that it's like easier to see when something's happening with someone else versus ourselves. We're better at, noticing like things in other people than we are in ourselves. And I do believe that's true, and including in relationships. So I think some of the warning signs is one big one, especially for young adolescents and young adults, and even younger teenagers, is when someone is being overprotective. So in the beginning, someone will be a little protective, and I'm speaking from a female's perspective, but it can happen either way. In any kind of relationship. It doesn't have to even be just a significant other romantic relationship. But if someone's being protective and is, kind of at first, people often like this. People are like, oh, that's very nice. He doesn't want me or she doesn't want me to talk to other people because they want me all to themselves. But there's a very fine line between when that protectiveness turns into abuse or abusive controlling behavior. And people are often not aware of this line. And so I think one way to recognize if it's happening with us is this person trying to control what I'm doing? Are they keeping tabs on where I am at all times? Are they making me share my location with them on my phone? When I say no to doing any of this, whether it's sharing my location or revealing everything to them, how do they react and how do they respond? And is it a continuing issue? The other thing is blaming the victim, so blaming me for everything. So like oftentimes someone will blame, say there's a boyfriend, for example, who's telling the girlfriend to share her location at all times, and she doesn't want to, so she says no. And then later he will use that, like the fact that she said no, to blame her. Like he'll say, well, I had to come to your house to check in on you because you wouldn't share your location, for example. So blaming her for everything is often a sign. So these are all subtle. And again, in aggregation, they become more of a sign of possibly being, violent later. Any power and control dynamics that are visible are good to keep tabs on early on because those only escalate as the relationship grows deeper. Because people who manipulate and who are abusers or who do engage in domestic, who do engage in domestic violence in their relationships against the victim, they're very manipulative and they're smart. They're not obvious at first at all because first they have to earn the trust of their person. Otherwise, the relationships wouldn't last that long. And so it's not like every victim of domestic violence knew it was coming. She did, or recognized it right away or anything like that. It's very calculated. It's very manipulative. It's very smooth the way they do it, unfortunately.
Yeah, we explain that to people. If it was blatantly obvious, you would have never gone on a date with this human being. You would have never gone past first date for sure. So it is very subtle. So when somebody does recognize it, and two things here, they come forward to you, a friend or a coworker, what can you do? Or two, where can they go? What are their options for getting support and help?
So what I would recommend is if someone comes to me with this, then I would make them aware of all their options and I would let them know that I'm supporting them. And the reason is because it takes an average woman in America. The statistics recently have been that it takes an average woman who is the victim of abuse in America to 7 times to leave, which means she's attempted or tried to leave the relationship 7 times and gone back. And on the 7th time, she's successful. That's the average. Now, it could be more, it could be less, of course. But that is terrifying. But it's very understandable as well because the psychological abuse and the emotional abuse that happens in these relationships have an everlasting impact, and they make it very difficult for the person to leave.
Yeah, I say this all the time when people say, what was she thinking? And I go, how could she? And it's all she. And I go, wait a second. Why don't you pause and say, how much damage has this abuser done that this person feels the need to come back? That's the question. Not how come she can't. It's how much abuse has the abuser done that is so important there.
Exactly. Because one way is to effective emotional abuse, for example, is to have the victim's self-confidence completely shattered and have them ruin their sense of self and their self-esteem so that they actually start to believe that they don't deserve any better, that this is the best it's going to get, this is fine, and it's always a cycle. The abusers are abusive, for example, so it might be once a week, it might be once a month, but it's a cycle. So after that, there's a period where they apologize and they're nice and things are better. And then there's hope and they're telling the person, I'm going to change. I'm going to get better. I'm going to do what I need to do to change, and then it repeats itself multiple times. And so there's always this false sense of hope that they give the victim in order to stay. And so that's part of the psychological abuse as well, which is why these victims often stay. No matter how smart. I've seen people who I've seen clients who are very, very intelligent, I've seen some who are, they're high professionals. They're very well educated, and they are equally susceptible to this, which makes it scary. And it's interesting because some of the tactics that the abusers use for their victims to stay are the same tactics that people like cults will use often to get people into these like religious cults or fundamentalist, crazy, racist cults or whatever there are. So
right,
these
brainstorming methods. I mean, brainstorming. Sorry, brainwashing. Yes.
Yeah, it's a lot of brainwashing. It's a lot of, and it's similar methods because the humans, we all operate similarly in terms of our brains, our fears, insecurities, vulnerabilities. So these are the things that, and many abusers are very smart. They get to know what someone's vulnerabilities and, insecurities are. They tap right into that. They know what the person wants to hear. They give them what they want to hear. They lure them in a certain way. So it's very similar to how someone would recruit someone for a cult and brainwash them. It's very similar tactics.
And so where does someone go?
There are different, depending on what the abuse is. I always recommend mental health counseling. So seeing a psychologist, because that can help with being able to start processing and sorting out that what is happening to me, because that's the hardest step. The hardest step, in my opinion, of seeing all my clients and seeing all these cases is recognizing that what you're going through is abuse. Because once someone recognizes that, they start to separate themselves from the relationship. They start seeing that, okay, I can leave this relationship. I can take back control of my life. I can leave this person, and I'm not the one who's all at fault. I'm not the one who's to blame. I don't deserve this. I can leave. Once that person starts reclaiming their sense of self and their agency, and that can be done very well through psychology, I believe, and through therapy, then they can start taking the other steps that they need to leave that relationship. Depending on there's a lot of community organizations and shelters, and the shelters will have referrals. So even if someone doesn't want to go stay in the shelter, say that, I can go stay with a friend or my sister or my mom in the meantime while we're separated. Given that we were living together, assuming that we were living together, say I can live with a family member or a friend in the meantime while we're separated, I can still call a shelter even if I don't want to sit there or stay there, just to get referrals to other organizations. So getting referrals to safety caseworkers, shelters and community organizations have caseworkers that can help with safety planning. They can help refer to lawyers, to therapists, to advocates for courts. And that really helps a lot, just to have a team and have some people on your side and understand what you're going through. They've seen it before. They're not going to judge you, or, there's no reason to be embarrassed. And so that's one example. There's obviously the police, but I'm weary to say that because police will respond in different ways. And sometimes say that a victim reports a domestic battery, say that she got hit by the abuser, and she reports that to the police, and the police don't arrest him, or that they do arrest him, but he's released 2 days later. I mean, sometimes there's a risk of that getting worse, and so of the anger and of the abuse getting worse after that. So I'm reluctant to say to go to the police. I do believe that in order to do some immediate damage control, it can be helpful. And if my client got, a domestic battery, I would say that the first step is police, but I would want a plan after that to follow through, a safety plan in place, or reaching out after the police to reach out to an attorney to get an order of protection, or to reach out to a caseworker at an agency to get some safety planning in place, or to move out of that residence. The person can't come back to you afterwards. I would want that to be in place.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
Yeah.
And you're giving so much great resources. Clearly, this is a very high traumatic working environment, right? You're dealing with a lot of survivors who are maybe struggling to get out still. So for you, how does somebody in your line of work, how do you maintain self-care and that work-life balance?
So for me, I work out a lot. I run outside, especially when the weather's nice. In Chicago, we finally got good weather.
Yeah.
So we're excited about that.
I'm just up the road from you, so I know exactly what you're referring to.
Oh, it's so beautiful out. Yeah. I work out a lot. I always engage in something creative. So I've taken improv classes, something that's totally mentally different. I've learned photography a little bit. So sometimes I'll take my camera, and I only work 9 to 5 or 8:30 to 5:30 so within like 40 to 50 hours a week.
I love that you said only 40, 50 hours a week. But in your line of work, people can be working 70 or 80. So it's a good point. Yeah.
Yeah, lawyers work more than that often.
You've given a lot of great resources here. It's awesome. We're going to make sure in our show notes, your LinkedIn is on there. So if people want to reach out to you, and the information you gave us for contacting you. So this has been so much good information. So thank you, Kinza.
Great. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. And for our listeners, you know what's next. That is question of the week. And this week's question is, Mike, are relationships meant to last forever? This is such a deeper question than a lot of people may read into it. And what I mean by that is all relationships can last forever. What I mean is they stay with you forever. Therefore, they're part of who you are. Now, does that mean that you're in that relationship, committed to that person forever? That's a different question. And I think it depends on the kind of relationship. Not all friendships are meant to last forever. Not all love relationships are meant to last forever. The question is, are you in a relationship that's meant to last forever? And that's when you have to think about. You have to contemplate for yourself. There's no blanket answer to are all relationships meant to last forever, because, well, actually there is to that one. It's no. They're not all relationships are not meant to last forever, because, the old saying, some people come into your life for a season, some for a reason, some for a lifetime. That kind of a cliche has some truth in it. So the fact is, you have to decide what relationships in my life are meant to last forever right now. What are the ones I want to treasure and value? And I want to make sure that I continue to nourish so they can last forever. And if I find out at one time they're not meant to last forever, to know that's okay. Not all relationships are. So thank you for asking, are relationships meant to last forever? We'd love to hear your questions, your thoughts, and your ideas. And the best place to leave those with us is on our Facebook page at facebook.com/Mutually Amazing Podcast. Of course, you can always contact us on our website at mutuallyamazingpodcast.com. Remember to subscribe to this show so you automatically get it every week. And if you could, take one moment to leave a review. That really helps other people find the show, which we are greatly appreciative of. So thank you so much for joining us. May you make today and every day a life full of mutually amazing relationships.